Welcome to today's Explainer. I'm so glad you're here, because we are diving headfirst into one of the most baffling, eerie, and honestly, stubbornly unsolved historical mysteries on the books. So, picture this with me, okay? It's a freezing, pale dawn, February 9th, 1855, in the sleepy county of Devon, England. The air is literally biting cold. Smoke is just starting to curl from the chimneys of these little thatch cottages, and the villagers are waking up to a world completely blanketed in this pristine, fresh snow. But the second they open their front doors, they realize something. They are absolutely not alone. So what exactly walked in the snow on February 9th, 1855? That is the exact question that has haunted historians for well over a century and a half now. Because what was waiting for those villagers in the snow? Footprints. And no, they weren't the tracks of a neighbor coming to borrow sugar, or a stray dog, or a horse, or frankly, any farm animal they'd ever seen before. What they found was a single, unbroken line of small, cloven footprints. And the wildest part, they were arranged exactly as if something was walking upright on two legs, stretching endlessly from their very doorsteps all the way out into the horizon. All right, Section 1, the scene of the crime, winter 1854 to 1855. Let's dive right into this.
Now, to really grasp the gravity of what happened that morning, we've got to understand the environmental setup. This wasn't just, a chilly week. We're talking about one of the most brutal, unforgiving winters southern England had experienced in living memory. Temperatures were hovering near or below freezing for months on end. Rivers that almost never freeze over, like the Exe and the Tang, were locked entirely solid in thick ice. I mean, it was so cold that locals were literally holding games right out there on the frozen river water. So the specific weather sequence on Thursday, February 8th is absolutely crucial for our investigation here. In the evening, the snow first begins to fall over this bitterly still landscape. Then, right in the middle of the night, there's a very brief thaw where the snow turns to rain. Finally, in the pre-dawn hours, the temperature absolutely plummets, creating a sudden, rock-hard frost. And why does all that matter? Well, because this specific sequence essentially created a massive, county-wide frozen mold. It perfectly sealed whatever tracks were left in that snow exactly as they were laid down.
By the time the sun came up, word was already spreading like wildfire. This wasn't just some isolated incident in a single lonely farmyard, no way. More than 30 different villages scattered across East and South Devon, and reportedly even bleeding over into neighboring Dorset, woke up to this exact same chilling phenomenon. From seasoned fishermen over in Topsham to isolated farmers way out near Dawlish, every single one of them found these identical tracks marking up their properties. The sheer, massive scale of this happening overnight is just staggering.
Moving on to Section 2, the impossible evidence, an unbroken trail. If we approach this like detectives opening up an icy cold case file, we have to look really closely at the primary physical evidence itself. Because the tracks weren't just strange in shape, they behaved in ways that honestly defied the laws of physics and biology. Let's start with the anatomy of the prints. The absolute most crucial point is that they were cloven, meaning they were split into two parts, much like the hoof of a deer, a goat, or, something unearthly. The prints were precisely 3 to 4 inches long, but here is the bizarre part. They were arranged in a continuous single-file line. If you think about normal four-legged animals, like a horse or a dog, they leave a paired side-by-side pattern. But these prints, they were placed strictly one in front of the other, step after step after step, exactly as if whatever made them was walking on two legs.
And guys, the evidence quickly goes from unusual to truly impossible. The tracks didn't just wander through the fields. Witnesses reported these two-legged, cloven prints marching straight up the vertical sides of buildings. And they didn't stop there. They continued without a single pause or break in their stride straight across the snow-covered rooftops high above the sleeping villagers.
And it gets stranger. The villagers documented the prints entering narrow drainpipes, and I mean narrow. Some of these pipes were barely 4 inches wide. That is far, far too small for any man, and definitely way too small for a dog or any large animal. Yet, the tracks would enter a pipe on one end and completely seamlessly exit out the other side completely undisturbed. The physical absurdity of this literally cannot be overstated.
Then, there was the water. In several locations, this unbroken trail marched right up to the edge of the Exe estuary. Now, normally, a trail ends at water, or, you'd at least see signs of scrambling, splashing, wading, something. Not here. The prints hit the water's edge on one bank and simply resumed on the opposite bank, with zero visible break. There was absolutely no sign of swimming, no sign of wading, and no sign of some flying creature landing. The trail just continued.
But perhaps the absolute most mind-bending piece of evidence came from a local farmer. He gave an account where this single-file line of prints reached one side of his haystack. Now, instead of going around it, the prints simply continued on the other side. The haystack itself was completely undisturbed. It was exactly as if the creature had passed clean through a solid mass of hay without displacing a single stalk, leaving no trace behind except the prints on either side.
Unsurprisingly, the media quickly got hold of this. One of the very first written accounts was a letter sent to the Exeter and Plymouth Gazette, and it described the tracks as the ramblings of some most busy and mysterious animal. I think that perfectly captures the immediate public confusion happening here. People were desperately trying to rationalize what they were looking at, and this letter pretty much sparked a massive media frenzy that would soon capture the attention of the entire country.
The aftermath of that morning was profound. A genuine, deep-seated supernatural terror gripped these locals. For days afterward, villagers were so paralyzed by fear that they absolutely refused to leave their homes after dark. Sunday church services saw clergymen preaching from the pulpit about a dark, demonic presence walking among them. But here is the most baffling fact of the whole shebang. Despite 30 villages waking up to tens of thousands of footprints, not a single person ever saw a creature. Whatever made these tracks seemingly moved only in the pitch black of night, perfectly out of sight.
All right, Section 3. The Suspects. Victorian Science versus the Unexplained.
So as the terror in the villages grew, so did the newspaper coverage. I mean, this story reached as far as Sydney, Australia. And with the coverage came the attempts by Victorian naturalists and scientists to step in, quiet the superstitious panic, and solve the case rationally. Suspect number 1 was actually put forward by an incredibly prestigious source, Sir Richard Owen, who was one of Victorian Britain's most respected biologists. He argued the badger was the only large, flat-footed animal native to the region that could leave such a long trail. But critics immediately tore this apart. Why? Well, badgers leave very clear claw marks, which were completely absent here. They absolutely do not walk in an unbroken, single-file line, and I think we can all agree badgers do not climb vertical walls and trot across snow-covered rooftops.
Next up was suspect number 2. This one was proposed by a local brewer named Thomas Fox, and his theory was hopping rodents, like mice or rats. His idea was that under those exact freeze and thaw weather conditions we discussed earlier, a tiny leaping mouse could leave a landing mark that melts and expands to resemble a single cloven hoof print. And honestly, this is actually considered one of the more scientifically credible explanations. However, a tiny mouse hopping simply cannot explain unbroken, straight lines spanning immense, county-wide distances in a single night. It just doesn't add up.
And then, of course, as the story went global, we got the fringe theories. Some whispered that an escaped kangaroo from a nearby private menagerie was bounding across the county. Others blamed an oddly moving otter. Decades later, a bit of local folklore even popped up claiming it was an experimental naval balloon that broke loose from a dockyard, dragging a frozen rope that scraped these odd marks into the snow as it drifted. It's a super fun image, right? But it rests on exactly zero first-hand evidence.
Now, what's really interesting is Section 4, the cold case verdict and the 1994 investigation. For nearly 100 years, the Devil's Footprints basically faded into mere local legend, until modern historians finally put it under a contemporary lens. See, back during the actual event, a country vicar named Henry Thomas Ellicombe from Clyce, St. George, quietly and meticulously collected first-hand accounts and sketches, but he kept them private. Fast forward to 1950, and a magazine appeal suddenly brings his forgotten records to light. This incredible treasure trove of preserved evidence allowed historian Mike Dash in 1994 to gather every surviving scrap of data and conduct the most thorough, definitive investigation this case has ever seen.
And here is Dash's honest, measured verdict. It is a tangled mystery. Dash concluded that no single theory fits every single bizarre detail. Instead, the Devil's Footprints were likely a massive amalgamation of factors. You had the tracks of various animals, like mice and badgers, distorted by those bizarre freeze and thaw weather anomalies. Then you combine that with a community completely swept up in mass panic and imagination, and you stir in highly exaggerated newspaper reports. All of these separate elements tangled together into one legendary, terrifying story.
And this actually brings us to the core of why this explainer matters today. It's all about the fear of uncertainty. Ultimately, this historical event is a mirror reflecting human nature. When faced with something we simply cannot explain, especially something literally right on our doorsteps, we become deeply uncomfortable. We would much rather reach for a massive, terrifying answer, even supernatural demons, than just sit quietly with the unknown. We crave explanations, even scary ones,
over having no explanation at all.
But despite the best efforts of Victorian scientists and modern historians piecing together weather anomalies and animal tracks, the case remains officially, stubbornly unsolved. We can never know for absolute certain what was out there on that freezing February night. So I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative thought to ponder. What do you think walked in the snow? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating cold case with me, and I will catch you in the next explainer.